It was one of those shifts that make you question whether you chose the right profession. 14 hours straight in the emergency department at Northwestern Hospital in Chicago. 3 cardiac arrests, 2 survivors, 1 who did not make it. I stepped out of the locker room with my scrub top soaked in sweat, and my whole body numb, carrying the familiar heaviness that always followed a long day spent wrestling with death, with tears, and with helplessness. All I wanted was to return to my small apartment, finish the last few slices of cold pizza in the refrigerator, turn on some meaningless reality show, and let my mind drift away, empty and silent, without thinking, without feeling, simply existing until morning. But the moment I opened my apartment door, I was no longer alone. He was there, sprawled on the floor of my living room, his body limp as he leaned against my old cream-colored sofa. A large smear of blood stained the carpet, spreading slowly from the fabric of his expensive shirt that clung to him like a second skin. His clothes were torn, his body covered in blood, his dark hair matted and sticky, and he looked as though he had just crawled out of a nightmare, unlike anything I had ever seen in my life. When the lights flicked on, his eyes opened wide, a wild mixture of terror, pain, and ruthless determination flashing in them, cutting straight through me. Before I could scream, he reached out and grabbed my wrist with astonishing strength, especially for someone losing that much blood. His hand was ice cold, but hard as steel. His voice was hoarse and ragged as he whispered, "Save me, or both of us will die tonight." And just like that, I, Rachel Morgan, a 28-year-old emergency room nurse who only wanted to watch television and eat cold pizza, stepped into a story I had never chosen. Because some decisions are not made with logic. Some moments give you only a few seconds, not enough to weigh right or wrong, only enough to move. And that night I moved. My last shift of that week had started at 7 in the morning, but stretched to nearly 10 at night because of a massive freeway pileup. Patients poured in endlessly, leaving no time to eat and no time to rest. I still remember my final patient, a middle-aged man suffering from a heart attack. We did everything we could, but he did not survive. I was the one who had to tell his wife. Her eyes went hollow when she heard the words. Then she collapsed into sobs like a grieving child. I nodded to my coworkers, removed my gloves, and walked out of the emergency department like a ghost. I stopped by the convenience store beneath the hospital, bought a bottle of water, and boarded the last northbound train. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building on West Roscoe Street, quiet, a little damp, but clean and private enough. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, reached for the keys in my coat pocket, hoping only that the floor would not be too cold, so I could collapse and sleep without bothering to turn on the heat. But the moment the door opened, every trace of exhaustion vanished in a sharp, icy jolt running down my spine. I saw the man, the blood, the eyes, the warning, the hand tightening around my wrist, anchoring me to the reality in front of me. I did not know who he was, why he was here, or how he had entered my locked apartment. But I knew one thing, something deep in the instinct that years of nursing had carved into me. I was looking at someone who would die if I did not help him immediately. And somehow, because of everything my profession had etched into me, I knew I could not turn away. I could not abandon him. I could not call the police. I had fewer than 10 seconds to choose help or do nothing. And I chose. Because some moments never offer a second chance. If you are still listening at this point, perhaps your heart is beating as fast as mine was in that moment. If this story has held you so tightly that you cannot turn away, please subscribe to the channel, like, and share the video so that more people can experience these breathless and deeply emotional moments every single day. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below, because I want to know how far this voice has traveled, whose hearts it has reached, and who has found themselves holding their breath, just as I once did when I saw that stranger lying on my living room floor. I knelt beside him, my whole body still locked tight with shock, yet my hands had already begun to move on their own. Professional instinct is something you do not control, especially when you are facing someone who is moments away from losing his life. I pushed my hair away from my forehead and let my eyes sweep quickly across his body to identify the most urgent wounds. One bullet wound grazing his left side, the blood pulsing out rapidly. Another wound to the right shoulder tearing through his shirt, where the fabric had split open and darkened with blood. His clothes were expensive, his Italian leather shoes scuffed from running, and on his wrist was a luxury watch I had never seen outside of glossy advertisements. The smell of gunpowder and blood mixed in the air thick and suffocating. Yet even through the pain, his eyes stayed wide open on me, as if trying to keep hold of control in a world that was slipping away from him. I let out a sharp breath and pressed my hand firmly against the wound on his abdomen to slow the bleeding. He groaned but did not fight me. I asked him for his name, but he only shook his head slightly, his face tightening with pain. I told him I needed something to call him by, but there was still no answer. I no longer had time to wait or to question why a man like this was lying in my apartment bleeding all over my floor, warning me that I would die too if I did not help him. I dropped my bag beside me and unlocked the medical kit I always carried as a survival habit. Inside were gloves, trauma shears, gauze, clotting pads, antiseptic suturing tools, and oral antibiotics. These were things I never imagined I would need at home. Yet now they were the only reason this stranger might survive. I spoke each step aloud as I worked, telling him I needed to cut his shirt open, that I had to check whether the wound had passed through, that I needed to know if he could stand, if I helped him into the bathroom. He did not respond immediately. He simply stared at me, then gave a small nod. His hand still held my wrist, and I could feel the strength fading from his grip. He was weakening fast. I slid the shears beneath his shirt and cut carefully until the fabric fell away, revealing a body marked with bold tattoos. Intricate symbols, possibly Italian or Latin signs I could not read, but knew instinctively were not decorative. Beneath the tattoos were bruises, cuts a fresh knife wound along the left side of his ribs, and countless scratches down both arms, the aftermath of a violent struggle not long before he appeared here. I leaned over and examined the wound on his side more closely. The bullet had torn a deep furrow through the muscle layer, but miraculously had not penetrated the abdominal cavity. It was a severe flesh wound, and while it missed the liver and spleen, if left untreated, infection would be inevitable. I pressed a clotting pad firmly against it and wrapped his torso with bandages, as I had done hundreds of times in the emergency room. Once the side wound was secured, I moved on to his shoulder. The bullet seemed to have passed through cleanly without shattering. I disinfected the wound, bandaged it carefully, and made sure none of the major vessels were under pressure. I could not take him to a hospital. That much was already clear. No hospital, no police, no one could know this was happening. I sank down onto the floor, breathing hard, my eyes still fixed on him. His body trembled slightly. His lips were losing color, yet his gaze remained sharp. He looked at me with something that for the first time resembled a flicker of relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough and carrying the faint lilt of someone not born in America, but who had lived here long enough for the accent to fade. "My name is Ethan," he added. I nodded and answered Rachel. Then I told him I needed to know how he had entered my home. The door had not been forced, there were no scratch marks, and I always kept the hallway light on and had never seen a stranger pass by. He answered in a voice that was both pained and unyielding. "I picked a building at random, a place no one would expect me to go. I had tools to unlock the door, and I was losing blood, so I had no other choice." I told him I had nothing to do with him, my voice beginning to shake, and that he had dragged me into something without giving me even a fragment of truth. Why should I believe him when he said we would both die if I did not help? "Because they are following me," he said. "And if they find me here, you will be a witness. And witnesses are never allowed to live. That is the rule." He closed his eyes and let out a long, exhausted breath. I could see the fatigue overtaking him. I checked his pulse, pressed my ear to his chest. It was still beating but faint. I would have to do much more if I wanted him to survive the night. And though every rational part of me screamed that this was the most reckless thing I had ever done, compassion and instinct were louder. I had to keep him alive. Because if he died, I would not only lose a patient, I might lose myself. I sank onto the floor, my back pressed against the leg of the table, my hands still stained with blood as I struggled to breathe steadily and keep myself from unraveling. A storm of questions spun through my mind, yet not a single answer felt solid or within reach. Ethan had already closed his eyes, his breaths heavy and uneven, too weak to give me another word. The apartment was unnervingly silent, the only sound the soft ticking of the old wall clock, a reminder that time was moving forward, and every choice I made now could shift the fate of us both. I closed my eyes for 1 second, just one, forcing myself to think clearly. I should call the police. I should have called the moment this started. A wounded stranger breaking into my home, issuing a chilling warning, forcing me to save his life. None of this was normal, and yet every word he had spoken echoed sharply in my head. If they find me here, you will die too. That is the rule. And it had not sounded like a threat. It had sounded like a sentence already written, cold and absolute. I glanced at my phone lying on the kitchen counter no more than 3 steps away. My hand almost reached for it out of instinct, but I stopped. I remembered the look in his eyes when he whispered, "Save me." It had not been the look of a man exploiting kindness. It had been the look of someone hunted, someone desperate enough to gamble his life on the first door he found, and behind that door had been me. I stood up, rinsed my hands in the sink, filled a glass with cold water, and returned to Ethan. I adjusted the pillow beneath his head, trying to keep him awake. His eyes fluttered open, faint and unfocused, like someone rising slowly from a distant dream. "Who are they?" I asked quietly but firmly. "Who will kill us?" He blinked once, then again, gathering himself. "Not now," he whispered in a rough, strained voice. "If I tell you, I cannot protect you anymore. I do not need you to protect me," I said, "but I need to know what I am facing. I cannot just sit here waiting for someone to break down my door." He swallowed hard and turned his head slightly, scanning the apartment as though reacquainting himself with reality. "I just need a few hours, Rachel. A few hours to steady myself. Then I will tell you. But if they track me down tonight, it is over. No police, no hospital, nothing will stop them. They are the kind of people who do not exist on paper. No one knows who they are. They follow a single rule and only one. If someone sees what they should not see, that person disappears." I swallowed tightly. His words sounded like a plot from a cheap spy film, yet the look in his eyes left no room for disbelief. The fear in him was real. A man with 2 bullet wounds, losing blood, barely conscious, yet still terrified for my life as much as his own. That was not an act. Panic began to rise in me, thick and suffocating, as though the air in my apartment had turned heavy. "I need to know who they are," I said again, meeting his gaze without looking away. He spoke slowly, each word weighted as if it cost him something. "If you know, you will never sleep again. And if they know, you know we will not live until morning. So please trust me." I nodded, not because I fully trusted him, but because I had no other choice left. I stood up, locked the door, shut off the hallway light, pulled the curtains closed, and checked each latch again. Then I returned to him with a blanket, spreading it over his body to keep his temperature from dropping further. My apartment, the one place that had always been my refuge after endless shifts, had transformed into a fragile fortress against a threat so large I could not yet name it. I looked at Ethan, his eyes half closed, his breath uneven, and I wondered what had driven him into my home, into my life, and what waited beyond that door. But there was one thing I knew with unsettling clarity. From the moment he gripped my wrist and spoke those words, I was no longer the same person. I had stepped into the gray space of choices that could never be undone. And tonight might be the night I finally learned just how thin the line is between saving a life and endangering your own. I sat on the edge of the sofa, holding a glass of cold water, whose ice had almost completely melted my mind, tangled as though I had awakened inside a dream with no exit. My small apartment rested in near darkness, lit only by the faint glow spilling from the kitchen, just enough for me to see the rise and fall of Ethan's breathing beneath the blanket. He had drifted off, or was at least trying to, but I knew whatever sleep he found would offer no peace. In my head, a single thought echoed over and over like a distant siren call: the police. Rachel, it is the right thing to do. It is the only way to protect yourself. But then I looked again at the stranger lying in my home, remembering his eyes, his words, the warning that had sliced through my mind like a knife ever since he spoke it. If they find me here, you will die too. Not the sudden kind of death, but the kind that is purposeful, deliberate. The kind where a person vanishes without a trace. Like countless others who may have disappeared into some darkness I have never had reason to imagine. I stood and walked toward the phone sitting on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, opened my contacts, and my finger hovered over the familiar name Chicago Police Department. All I had to do was press call and say that a wounded man had broken into my home, and I was scared. As a nurse, I had done my part, provided first aid, kept him alive, but now I needed law enforcement. I had the right to do that. I even had the obligation. And yet my hand trembled as I hovered over the final button. I caught my reflection in the glass of the kitchen cabinet, seeing my eyes sunken in red, not only from exhaustion, but from something else: fear, pity, or something deeper I was not ready to name. I thought of the times I had seen patients cling to my hand in terror, needing something, anything, to keep them tethered to life. I thought of the first patient I ever lost, and the crushing helplessness of it. I did not know who Ethan was, or whether he deserved trust, but I knew one thing: if I called the police, he would be taken away. Maybe to a jail, maybe to a hospital, but definitely out of my hands, out of my sight, beyond my ability to monitor him or keep him alive. And if his warning was true, if someone really was hunting him, a public hospital would be the easiest place in the world for them to find him. I set the phone down, inhaled deeply, and returned to the living room. Ethan still had not stirred. I knelt beside him and gently checked the bandages around his abdomen. The bleeding had stopped, and the wound had begun to dry around the edges, but he was still far from stable. His body temperature was dropping, so I spread another blanket over him. The early November wind seeped through the imperfect window frame, bringing with it a damp chill that filled the room. I picked up my phone again, this time not to call the police, but to look up pharmacies that stayed open late. I needed more antibiotics, antiseptic sterile gauze, maybe morphine if I was lucky. The shop on Belmont Street was open until midnight. I checked the clock. 10:30. I could make it if I left right now. But I could not leave Ethan alone, not when I had no idea whether someone was watching this building. I went into my bedroom and retrieved the folding knife my father had given me when I was in college. I had never expected to use it, yet tonight everything felt different. I placed it on the table within reach. If someone came in, I needed time to react. And if Ethan woke in a state I could not predict, I needed a plan. Logic inside me still screamed in protest, insisting I was dragging myself into something irreversible. But a part of me, the part that had looked death in the eye, the part that had taken 14-hour shifts to keep someone alive for even a few extra hours, believed that tonight I had to follow the instinct that went against every rule. Not because I trusted Ethan, but because I trusted my own hands, my own training, my own will to save a life. And sometimes to save someone you have to step outside the boundaries of what is safe and allowed. Tonight I would not call the police. I would keep him alive myself. And I would accept whatever price came with that choice. I did not sleep. The entire night I sat watch beside the sofa where Ethan lay, his faint, uneven breathing, the only sound echoing through my small apartment. From time to time I placed my hand on his forehead to check his temperature, then adjusted the bandages wrapped around his abdomen and shoulder. The wounds were no longer bleeding. yet his body remained dangerously weak, a sheen of sweat beginning to gather along his forehead and neck. I gave him another antibiotic pill, laid a cool cloth across his brow, and tried to keep his fever from rising. Outside the window, the city seemed suspended in an unusual hush. No car horns, no footsteps, only the wind slipping through the cracks of the fogged glass, and a growing sense of unease tightening steadily in my chest. I looked at the clock. It was past 2 in the morning. Everything appeared to be settling into a fragile stillness when I suddenly heard a knock at the door. 3 knocks. Short, sharp, deliberate. I jolted upright, as though struck by electricity, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. No one knocked on my door at this hour. I held my breath and crept toward the entrance, my legs heavy, unsteady. I kept the lights off and leaned toward the peephole. In the dim hallway light, I saw 3 men. All 3 wore dark jackets and baseball caps, standing close together as though hiding something behind them. One of them stared directly into the peephole, as if he knew my eye was pressed against it. I recoiled, my pulse kicking into a frantic rhythm. No one spoke, no greeting, no questions, just silence. I moved away and hurried back to the living room, bending down to shake Ethan gently. He did not wake. I shook him harder, whispered urgently into his ear, calling his name again. Ethan, there are people outside the door. He blinked his lips, moving faintly. It took several seconds for awareness to return to his eyes. When I mentioned the 3 men, his eyes flew open, his entire body tightening instinctively. They are here, he murmured, trying to sit up but managing only a few inches before pain contorted his face. Can they get in? I asked. He shook his head. Not if the door stays locked. But they will try. They may pick it. They may use another way. I swallowed hard, rushed to turn off the remaining lights, and grabbed the folding knife from the table. I had never used it in any real situation beyond imagination, and now it was the only thing that made me feel the slightest hint of control. The knocking returned louder this time. 5 knocks. Urgent, insistent. I did not respond. Did not move. The apartment fell into a stillness so absolute it seemed to swallow the air itself. Ethan whispered in a strained voice, "If they suspect I am here, they will not leave. But if they think you are alone, they might retreat." I stared at him, a cold weight settling in my stomach. He was telling me I had to answer the door. I had to act, had to pretend I knew nothing. The thought sent a shiver tearing through me. But if I did nothing, they would break in. And then we would both be trapped with no way out. I stood, walked toward the door, still closed, and spoke through it. "Who is it?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. A man's voice answered, polite yet icy. "Sorry, is this apartment 3020? I hesitated. "No, this is 301. You have the wrong place." A pause followed, then a soft, almost amused laugh. "Sorry to bother you." Yet the 3 silhouettes did not leave. I checked the peephole again and saw one of them pressing his ear against the door, listening, while another scanned the hallway. My muscles tightened, my hand gripping the knife with all its trembling strength. Finally, after what felt like hours, the 3 men turned and descended the stairs. I did not let myself breathe until their footsteps faded completely. I turned back to Ethan. He was watching me. "Good," he whispered. "They might come back," I said. He nodded. "They will. But not now." I set the knife on the table, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I had never felt myself so close to death, not even after all my years in the emergency room. There were no gunshots, no blood, no injuries, only 3 strangers standing outside my door, and the paralyzing sense that if I chose the wrong word, the wrong movement, the wrong breath, I would no longer exist to tell the story. I returned to Ethan and stared at him. "Who are they?" I asked again for the 3rd time that night. And this time, after a long, heavy silence, he answered softly. "The people I once called my team, and now they want me erased. Me and you." I did not know what waited ahead, but from the moment they stood outside my door, I understood I no longer belonged to the world of ordinary life. And Ethan was no longer just a stranger in need of medical help. He was the key to something larger, darker, and I was already caught in its grip. There was no retreat, no going back. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the three men standing motionless outside my door, the way they had not needed to knock again, just stood there listening, waiting, as if they already knew exactly what was inside. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, never deeply asleep, groaning quietly whenever I moved, as though his body had been stretched to the edge of its endurance. I sat beside him, knees pulled to my chest, eyes fixed on the door, listening to every faint sound that passed through the hallway. At 4 in the morning, my phone vibrated softly. A message from an unknown number appeared. No name, no punctuation, just 4 stark words. Who are you? I stared at the words as if they might burst into flames. No one had my number except the hospital and a handful of close friends. I did not respond. 1 minute passed, then another message. How long have you known him? My hands went cold, yet I forced myself to stay steady. If they had my number, they had already traced me here, and if they were asking questions, it meant they were not certain. It meant I still had a chance to mislead them. I opened the keyboard and typed slowly, choosing each word as carefully as if I were performing surgery. I do not know who he is. He broke into my home last night. I am a nurse. I am not involved. The message sent. 1 minute. 2 minutes. No reply. I looked at Ethan. Sweat dotted his forehead. His lips were cracked and dry, but his chest still rose and fell. He needed time. I could only hope my lie had bought us a few hours. The phone vibrated again. What does his voice sound like? I bit my lip. They were testing me. They wanted to be sure I truly knew nothing. I typed again. Rough voice. Slow. I think he is badly hurt. Not awake much. I am scared. A moment later, another message arrived. Someone will come check in the morning. Do not call police. If you do, you die first. My heartbeat thrashed against my ribs. They were not done. They were pushing step by step. I looked around the apartment, still dark and silent, but now every wall felt like it had eyes, every crack like someone was watching. I returned to Ethan and shook him gently. Ethan, wake up. They know I am hiding you. His eyes opened and he struggled to sit up before pain forced him back. I told him about the messages. His expression changed instantly from exhaustion to sharp alertness. They are testing you, he said. If they catch you lying, neither of us will survive until morning. I swallowed hard, my pulse refusing to slow. They said they will come in the morning. He nodded and whispered, Then we need to clean up. Hide everything connected to me. You must look like a normal woman, a nurse living alone, frightened after a break-in. No elaborate lies, just enough truth. I did exactly as he said. I changed the bed sheets, stuffed his clothes into a trash bag, scrubbed the bloodstains from the floor, burned the used gauze, and masked the lingering metallic scent with the essential oils I always used to unwind after a shift. I hid him inside the storage closet near the kitchen, the only space with no windows, dark and tight enough that no one would notice unless they searched thoroughly. He agreed reluctantly only after I promised to leave the knife in his hand for protection. At 6 in the morning, the doorbell rang. I was already in my nurse's uniform, my hair tightly pinned up, my face lightly made up to hide the shadows beneath my eyes. I opened the door and came face to face with a man in a gray suit, someone who did not look like police and did not look like building staff. His gaze was calm, his faint smile practiced as if knocking on strangers' doors was routine for him. You're Rachel Morgan. I nodded. He looked around me, taking in the apartment, then asked, Did anything unusual happen last night? I inhaled slowly, steadying my voice. Yes. A stranger broke into my home. I do not know who he is. He was injured. I gave him first aid and he left. I was terrified. He did not take notes or ask for details, only nodded. Did you call the police? I shook my head. I did not want trouble. I was afraid of being watched. He studied me for several long seconds, as if reading through every thought behind my eyes. Then he nodded again. Thank you for cooperating. If anyone asks, keep this exact story. If not, it will be troublesome. He turned, walked down the stairs, and vanished. I shut the door, leaned back against it, my legs trembling uncontrollably. Ethan had been right. They did not want to kill me. Not yet. They only wanted to be sure I would not tell the truth. And to stay alive, I had to learn to lie. A lie that felt real. A lie that saved a life. I locked the door tightly after the man left, still feeling the trace of his gaze gliding over every inch of my apartment, like a cold blade sliding across skin. Everything looked exactly as it had, yet I knew that one misplaced detail, one crack in the story, and I would not get a second chance to fix it. I returned to the closet and opened the door where Ethan had been hiding. He sat slumped against the wooden wall, his face pale from blood loss, his dry eyes meeting mine with a quiet understanding that the encounter had gone as well as it possibly could. I helped him out and guided him to the bathroom. His body felt weightless, yet unbearably heavy with exhaustion and pain. I settled him on the edge of the bathtub, turned on the warm water, and gathered towels and antiseptic soap. Dried blood clung to his skin in dark streaks, forming a rough, cracked shell across his neck, shoulders, abdomen, and arms. I had never imagined I would one day bathe a wounded stranger in my own apartment in circumstances where a single unexpected sound could mean death. Yet at this moment he no longer felt like a stranger. He was Ethan, the man I had kept alive, the man who had pulled me into a nightmare with no clear path out. And in a strange way, I could not explain someone I could not walk away from. I soaked the cloth and gently wiped from his neck downward, the warmth making him shiver, though he uttered no sound. Each time I touched a wound, his muscles tightened with pain, but he forced himself to stay still. I asked softly, "Ethan, who are you?" He remained silent for a moment, then exhaled as if releasing a weight he had carried far too long. "I was once part of a covert unit," he said. "Not officially government, but hired by them. The kind of people who, if captured, had no records, no lawyers, no country claiming them. We handled the things no one else wanted to stain their hands with." I stopped my hand, waiting. Ethan continued, his voice low and steady, as if reciting a memory he wished he could erase. "At first, I believed I was doing the right thing. Tracking terrorists, stopping human trafficking, dismantling hidden networks that threaten national security. But it changed. The missions grew murky, the targets no longer clearly right or wrong. Once we were ordered to eliminate an investigative journalist because he planned to release documents that would ruin a high-ranking official. I refused, and from that moment on, I became a traitor. I disappeared, cut all ties, tried to live a different life. But I knew they would never let me go. I bowed my head and continued carefully wiping the blood from his arm. "Do you have any evidence?" I asked. Ethan nodded weakly. "I hid it. I cannot bring it out now. In the wrong hands, it means nothing. They are not just here to kill me. They want every trace wiped clean. And if you are involved, Rachel, they will not let you live." I swallowed hard, my hands still moving while my mind began to spin. It was all too big, too deep, too dangerous, far beyond anything I had ever imagined. I looked at Ethan and for the first time did not just see an injured man on the edge of death. I saw someone carrying an entire silent war within him, a war no one outside these walls would ever know existed. I finished cleaning his wounds and helped him into clean clothes I had pulled from my laundry bag. They did not fit well, but they were warm enough. I handed him a glass of water and sat across from him. "Can I run?" I asked bluntly. "If I leave you, if I go back to my old life?" Ethan looked at me, his eyes neither angry nor pleading, only filled with a deep, tired sadness. "If you are lucky, you might escape. But if they suspect, you will still be the next name. And besides, I do not think you are the kind of person who walks away halfway. I looked away, unable to deny it. He was right. I was not the kind of person who turned my back. And now that I knew the truth, I could not pretend ignorance. I had saved him from death. But now I might need to save myself from a truth I had never asked to know. Ethan sat leaning against the chair, his body freshly cleaned, but his eyes burdened with a weight that felt as though he carried an entire past he had never wanted to speak aloud. I could see it in the way he stared at the floor, silent for a long time after telling me about his former work, about the nameless organization he once served. Those were not just fragments of a hunted life. They were open wounds still quietly bleeding beneath the skin. I poured him another glass of water, sat beside him, and for the first time in my 28 years of living and 6 years of nursing, I found myself asking a question I had never dared to ask anyone. Who did you betray, Ethan? He looked up at me, his gray eyes still like a lake in the middle of the night. Not who he said, but everyone. He paused, then exhaled slowly. I trusted them. Marcus, my commander. Julia, our analyst. Cole, the one who was always at my side during every mission. We once moved like a single unit, so in sync that one glance was enough to know what needed to be done. We had survived death together more times than I can count, always walking that thin line between life and the end of everything. But then one mission changed everything. He closed his eyes briefly, his throat tightening around the memory. 3 years ago, we were deployed to Eastern Europe on an operation that was suspicious from the start. They told us we were dismantling a money laundering network tied to terrorism. But when we arrived, all I saw were investigative journalists carrying thousands of classified documents about covert United States government projects. They were not criminals. They were truth seekers. And our orders were to make them disappear. I refused. I asked for source verification. I wanted to withdraw, but Marcus did not. He ordered us to proceed, and when I refused, they turned their guns on me. Julia fired the first shot. She did not aim for my head, only meant to warn me, but Cole did not hesitate. If I had not run, I would have died there. I was wounded, fell into the river, and everyone believed I was dead. From that moment on, I lived under a new identity, constantly moving, reaching out to no one. Until a week ago, when I learned Marcus and Julia were planning to eliminate a former operative who had walked away like I had. He had evidence, enough to expose nearly a decade of their crimes. We met once. He gave me the flash drive and told me that if he vanished, I had to bring the truth into the light. I never made it out of the city before they found me. And the rest, you already know. I sat in silence for a long time. There had been no gunfire in his story, no fresh blood spilled. Yet it was so heavy I felt the room shrinking inch by inch around us. Something in me wanted to believe Ethan had done the right thing, but another part wondered whether he was truly innocent. I had no proof to be certain of anything, but I knew one thing: the scars on his body were not fake, and the way he spoke each name without hatred, without anger, only with sorrow, told me he had once loved them like family. I turned away, not wanting him to see the confusion in my eyes. Some stories should never be told, because once you hear them, you cannot go back. But I had heard. I had learned. And now I was no longer just the person who kept Ethan from bleeding out. I was someone holding a piece of the truth, a truth that, if mishandled, could kill us both. Ethan had betrayed his organization to save his conscience. And I, in my own way, had betrayed the quiet life I once lived to step into a world where no one is innocent anymore. I stayed awake the entire day, as though closing my eyes for even a moment would make everything disappear, or worse, that I would wake in a different world entirely, one where the dried blood on the floor had hardened into the permanent trace of a choice that could never be undone. Ethan managed to sleep for a few hours after telling me about Marcus, Julia, and Cole, 3 names that hovered in my mind like invisible ghosts. But when the clock approached 9 in the evening, he jolted upright with a tension so sharp it cut through the room. They will come back, he said. Not like this morning, not to probe. Next time, it will be action. I looked at him sitting there in my old shirt, his face still pale but his eyes bright again, like a soldier snapping awake. We have to leave. Tonight. I nodded. There was no room for hesitation. I gathered what we needed, my medical kit, some cash, identification, a little dry food. Ethan showed me how to wipe down surfaces, how to remove traces, how to seal anything with blood into plastic bags before tossing them in the building's outside bin. He was weak, but he forced himself to move, gritting his teeth with each step. I asked if we should call anyone for help, but he shook his head. No one can be trusted. We left the apartment just before 10 that night. The cold wind slapped against our faces, carrying the damp smell of rain that had only recently stopped. I pulled a thicker coat over Ethan's shoulders and wrapped his arm around mine to support him. No one paid attention to us, just two people who looked like they were leaving a hospital, blending into the sparse crowd along West Roscoe Street. We did not take a car. Ethan warned that if any tracking devices were active, we would be caught immediately. Instead, we headed to the train platform and boarded the 10:13 train at Belmont Station. The underground stop was nearly empty, the dim lights making everything look like an old black and white film. I heard footsteps echoing down another corridor, my heart racing in time with each hollow sound, but no one ever appeared. The train arrived. We entered the last car empty and quiet. Ethan dropped onto a seat, breath-shaky sweat seeping through his shirt despite the cold. He was far from recovered, and each passing minute made my worry grow sharper. He handed me a small scrap of paper ink scrawled unevenly across it. An address on the western edge of the city. My safe house. The only person I trust is waiting there. His name is Ray. I held the paper tightly, reading it again and again, as if it might vanish if I did not memorize it fast enough. When the train reached the final stop, we stepped out and hailed a long-distance taxi, paying in cash. The driver looked at us, then at Ethan, and asked only one question: "Do you need a hospital?" I shook my head. "He is recovering. He just needs to go home." We remained silent for the entire ride. Outside, bare trees lined the roads and quiet neighborhoods glowed faintly with warm yellow porch lights, but nothing felt peaceful. It felt instead like we were drifting through a fog where nothing was certain. Near midnight we arrived, a small house set far back from the empty road in a neighborhood with almost no streetlights. The door opened the moment we reached the porch. A man in his 50s, hair streaked with gray, stepped out. "Rachel, Ethan. Get inside, now." His name was Ray, and there was no need for questions. He looked at Ethan the way someone might look at a lost child. Returned home, then turned to me with a gratitude he did not try to hide. When the door closed behind us for the first time in 2 days, I felt something like safety. But I also knew it was only a temporary stop in a journey with no clear end. I had stepped into the escape with Ethan. And from this moment on, every breath I took, every step we made was part of a race to stay alive. There was no map, no perfect plan, only a truth swelling like a time bomb, and if we did not move fast enough, it would explode and take us both with it. Ray's house sat tucked deep within a wide stretch of land surrounded by an old wooden fence and tall pine trees whispering in the night wind. From the outside, it looked like an abandoned winter retreat, but inside, it was outfitted like a discreet miniature fortress. The door had 3 layers of locks. The windows were covered with film that blocked any view from outside, and small, nearly invisible security cameras were placed in every corner. Ray led us into the living room before heading straight to the kitchen, returning with a carefully sealed metal first aid kit. He did not need to ask. He already knew what needed to be done. I sat beside Ethan on the soft gray velvet sofa and handed him a cup of warm water Ray had prepared. He drank slowly, his movements still sluggish, but the emptiness in his eyes had faded since the train station. Ray took a seat across from us, gave me a cup of ginger tea, and studied us in silence before speaking in a voice roughened by years of cigarettes. "So you survived. I don't know if that's good news or bad, Ethan." His words carried no anger, and no relief, only the complicated emotion of someone who had seen enough to know survival did not guarantee peace. Ethan simply nodded. Ray turned to me. "And you're the one who pulled this kid out of death's mouth." I nodded, feeling no need to explain anything further. Ray leaned back and sighed. "I told you before you'd drag someone else into this sooner or later. No one makes it out alone." Ethan's fingers tightened around mine in a silent apology. I knew I was standing between two men who were far too familiar with darkness and endless pursuit, and somehow because of that I felt oddly safe. Ray guided us into a small room in the back, once an office, but now rearranged as a temporary resting space. There was a narrow bed, a worn armchair, a bookshelf packed with thick folders and maps scattered across the walls. I helped Ethan lie down while I sat beside the bed. Ray left a tray containing painkillers, antibiotics, bottled water, and a few protein bars, then stepped out without another word. The first night in the safe house held no car horns, no footsteps in the hall, only the sound of the wind slipping through the window seams and Ethan's faint, uneven breathing. I sat near him, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling where the white paint had begun to peel. My body ached, yet my mind was alert in a way that felt unnatural. I was in a place completely unfamiliar, surrounded by two men I had known for only a few days, wrapped in a secret that could get me killed at any moment. And yet, I was not afraid, at least not in the usual sense. Perhaps because I knew I had crossed the point of no return, or perhaps because deep down I realized that the life I used to live, the endless shifts, the cold apartment, the rushed meals, was no longer a life I wanted to return to. Ethan spoke very little throughout the night. He only turned toward me occasionally, his eyes saying everything language could not. I knew he was grateful, and I also knew that if I had to choose again, I would still save him even if it meant living in fear for the rest of my life. Near 3 in the morning, just as I was dozing off in the chair, Ethan whispered my name. "Rachel." I sat upright instantly. He looked at me, his eyes softened. "Thank you for everything." I gave him a small smile and placed my hand over his cooling one. "Rest. We'll talk tomorrow." He closed his eyes without replying, but I saw the faint lift at the corner of his mouth, a rare flicker of hope. For the first time since I found him bleeding on my living room floor, he seemed truly at ease. And in that moment, I allowed myself to believe that although the road ahead was long and perilous, at least we had made it this far. Through the first night, in a place where for the first time in years, Ethan was seen as a person rather than a target. Morning in Ray's house did not arrive with sunlight spilling through the curtains the way it did in the normal days I once knew. Here the light filtered weakly through heavy drapes that smelled of dust, casting a pale gray wash across the walls. I woke in the armchair, my back aching, my head heavy, but the first thing my eyes searched for was Ethan. He was still there, lying quietly, his breathing steadier, his skin slightly less pale, the tension in his shoulders no longer pulling tight with every small movement. When I stood to get water, he opened his eyes and whispered my name with the familiarity of a reflex that reached deeper than either of us intended. "Rachel." His voice was low but warm, like a reminder that amid all the chaos, there was still some intact sliver of emotion between us, something untouched by fear or running or blood. I returned to sit at the edge of the bed, and he looked at me with a focus that no longer carried suspicion or guardedness. It was a calmness, as though he had stopped running at least for these few minutes. I placed my hand lightly on his forehead, measuring his temperature with the instinct of a nurse, but also aware that this was the first touch that wasn't solely meant to heal. "Cooler than last night," I murmured with a small smile. He smiled too faintly. "You didn't leave," Ethan whispered. The softness in his voice surprised me, and though I didn't answer immediately, we both already knew the truth. Deep down, I understood that I had long since had the chance to walk away. When Ethan slept, when Ray turned his back, I could have run back to the life that belonged only to me. But I stayed. And the greater part of that choice was no longer fear of what would happen if I left him, but because I wanted to remain. I looked at him for a long moment before finally answering. I am not the kind of person who walks away halfway. Ethan closed his fingers gently around mine, his grip weak but warm, and said softly, "You saved me. Not just once, even in the moments I couldn't speak when I couldn't ask." Heat stung my eyes, and I could not tell whether it came from exhaustion or from the unexpected weight of being seen, truly seen in a way I had not felt in years. The room was quiet, filled only with the whisper of the wind through the pines outside and the slow, steady ticking of the clock, and I felt a pull inside me to break the fragile distance that still lingered. I leaned in my eyes, never leaving his face, no longer looking at him with pity, but with something else. Something I had once believed I no longer had the courage to feel after so many wounds and so much weariness. He did not pull away. Ethan's eyes closed just as I lowered myself toward him, and my lips brushed his for the first time. It was not the hurried kiss of two people desperate for each other, nor the reckless impulse of two souls weakened by danger. It was a kiss between two people who had passed through fear, through blood, through survival, reaching for each other, not with words, but with a fragile trust built from the truest wounds. When I pulled back, Ethan kept his eyes closed, but a small smile curved at his lips so gently, I almost missed it. "Thank you," he whispered again, but this time his voice carried a warmth that filled the room. I nodded silently and stayed beside him, my hand still holding his. In that moment, the room needed nothing more. Just the two of us, two heartbeats, and a first kiss that tore down the thin wall separating survival from feeling, reminding me that sometimes, while running from death, we stumble into the most beautiful proof of life. The next morning, before the first light could slip through the heavy curtains, Ray knocked on the door, his low, steady voice unable to hide its urgency. "We need to meet him today." Ethan pushed himself upright slowly, his body still fragile, but his eyes sharp again the way they had been before everything unraveled. I looked at the two men and felt once more the weight of being pulled into a plan I only understood in fragments. "Who is he?" I asked. Ray glanced toward Ethan, then answered, "He's a lawyer, but not the kind who works in a courthouse. The kind people go to when they want a name erased from the system or when they need a case to disappear quietly. His name is Dominic Rivas, and if anyone can help Ethan bring the evidence to light while keeping him alive, it's him." We left the safe house just before 10, driving an old car Ray kept hidden in the shed. The license plates switched out before we pulled away. Dominic never met clients in an office. He chose places without cameras, without witnesses, without traces. Our meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the south side of Chicago, where the wind howled through cracks in the rotting walls, and the light was just enough to see each other's faces. Dominic arrived exactly on time, a tall, thin man in a simple black suit, thin-framed glasses and eyes sharp as blades. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, then turned his gaze to me. "You're the nurse." I nodded, but before I could speak, he continued. "I know who you are. Rachel Morgan, Northwestern Hospital Emergency Department." A chill ran down my spine. Not because of the words, but because of the way he said them, like my entire life had been an open file on his desk long before I appeared. Dominic set a black leather case on the splintered wooden table, opened it, and pulled out a small laptop along with several folders. Ethan reached into his shirt and withdrew the tiny USB drive wrapped in medical bandage, handing it to him without hesitation. Dominic plugged it in, opened encrypted files, and scanned through them with quick, precise eyes. Unapproved assassinations, internal operation codes that never existed in official records, and foreign bank transfers linked to Marcus and Julia. Dominic closed the laptop, nodded once, then looked at Ethan. "This is real. But it also means that if I touch it, they will hunt me to the ends of the earth. I need to know what else you have to bargain with besides evidence." Ethan paused, his jaw tightening, then finally said, "I don't need you to expose everything. I only need you to protect one person, Rachel. She's not involved, but now she's caught in it. I need her erased from everything. Her name, her image, her files. Dominic stared at me for a long time without a flicker of emotion. After nearly a full minute, he nodded slowly. I'll do it. But in exchange, you will give me the full identities of everyone still alive who ever worked in that organization. Ethan lowered his gaze, his hand tightening into a fist before he nodded. Consider it repayment. Dominic stood, packed his things, and said, I need 2 days. Until then, neither of you can leave the safe house. Ray will handle the logistics. If I finish in time, there will be a car to take you out of the state, new passports, clean records. Ethan stays put until everything is released. And with no handshake and no goodbye, Dominic walked away, arriving like a shadow, working like a machine, leaving as though he had never existed at all. On the drive back, no one spoke. The wind slapped against the car windows, as if reminding us that time was running out, and whatever we had done today might decide who lived and who didn't tomorrow. Ethan took my hand in the back seat for the first time, not out of fear or pain, but simply to feel grounded, to know I was still there. And I tightened my hand around his, saying nothing, because deep inside I understood that whether Dominic succeeded or not, we had stepped into a place where there was no turning back. It was no longer just running, it was choosing to confront, choosing to expose the darkness, and accepting that we might have to trade everything we had to bring the truth into the light. We returned to the safe house a little after 2 in the afternoon, beneath a sky so heavy and gray, it felt like a warning of something dark pressing toward us. Ray made a full sweep around the property, checked the security cameras, the locks, every blind spot, then looked at us as if he wanted to say something but chose silence instead. Ethan was nearly depleted, stretched out on the sofa with his head resting on my thigh while I gently ran my fingers through his hair, my chest tightening under a weight of unease I could not name. Dominic had said he needed 2 days. We had made it barely 6 hours. I was not someone who believed in vague intuition, yet something in the atmosphere of the house, the unnatural stillness, the faint, unfamiliar noises outside that had not been there before, pulled every nerve in me taut like a wire ready to snap. Around 3:30, Ray went down to the basement to check the generator. Ethan had fallen asleep again, breathing heavily. I stayed in the living room, my eyes fixed on the surveillance feed, watching the 4 corners of the property cycle on the small screen. Suddenly, the rear camera flickered with a brief static ripple. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes. Before I could call for Ray, a faint metallic tap came from the back door. Just a single sound, soft, almost delicate, but sharp enough to propel me to my feet. I rushed to the basement door and called down, "Ray, something's wrong." No answer. I hurried down the steps, my heart pounding against my ribs. The staircase opened into darkness. The basement lights were off. When I reached the last 2 steps, I saw him, Ray, lying crumpled beside the generator, blood seeping from the back of his head, his eyes wide open and vacant. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My legs trembled so violently I nearly fell, but I forced myself to turn back, climbing quickly, fumbling for my phone. No signal. And then came the sound glass shattering in the kitchen. One crack, then another, then a third. Someone, no, several people were inside the house. I sprinted into the living room and shook Ethan hard. "Wake up! They're here!" Ethan jolted awake, still dizzy but reacting instantly. He grabbed the knife from beneath the pillow, eyes locking on mine, demanding answers. I gasped the truth in a single breath. "Ray is dead." His jaw clenched, and he pulled me toward the staircase leading to the attic. It was the emergency exit Ray had told us about, connected to the roof with a path that led toward the trees in the back. We were only 3 steps up when the front door exploded open. 3 men in black, masked, armed, stormed inside. Ethan yanked me up into the attic, slammed the hatch shut, but we didn't have time to lock it. Heavy footsteps thundered below, followed by a cold voice issuing orders. "Search every room. Kill anyone still breathing." Ethan pushed aside a loose panel in the ceiling, revealing the exit to the roof. He motioned for me to go first, and I crawled into the icy night air. Wind sliced against my cheeks as we maneuvered onto the shingles. The roof was slick, the tiles loose beneath our hands. We crawled toward the back edge where a tall pine tree leaned close to the house. "Jump first," Ethan whispered. "I'll catch you." He descended like a shadow, hit the ground with a hard roll, then reached up. I took a breath and jumped, the impact numbing my entire body, but there was no time to think. A gunshot cracked through the air. A bullet sliced past my ear and shattered a branch just above my head. We ran headlong into the woods. Shouts erupted behind us. Dogs barked. More shots followed. But the forest was thick, the sky dimming, and we knew the terrain better than they did. Ethan pulled me left, then sharply right, then suddenly pushed me down into a shallow ravine covered in dry leaves. He dropped on top of me, shielding me with his body. We held our breath. Footsteps thundered above. A shadow paused, listening, scanning, then moved on. Only when the sounds faded did Ethan exhale. I gripped his hand, my palms soaked with cold sweat. He leaned close, his voice barely more than a breath against my ear. "We have to leave the state. Tonight." I nodded. The safe house was no longer safe. Ray was gone. Dominic was still away. All we had left was each other and a thin, fraying chance at survival. And though my heart hammered like it might crack open, I had never felt so certain of a choice. If I had to run, I would run with Ethan. If I had to fight, I would fight beside him. And if this road ended here, I would go to the very end. No turning back, no regret. We followed the edge of the forest for nearly an hour, our footsteps crunching over dry leaves in a darkness so thick and damp it felt alive around us. My heart pounding not from fear, but from the knowledge that one wrong sound, one misplaced step, could end everything. Ethan moved ahead of me, still guiding the way, even as his breath grew heavier, his wounded shoulder seeping fresh blood where the strain had forced the stitches open. I saw each drop fall to the ground, each mark he left behind impossible to hide, and I knew I had to act. We reached a narrow dirt road where, if luck allowed, we might find a passing car. But before I could speak, Ethan collapsed, his body folding to the earth like a tree cut from its roots. I rushed to him, catching his weight in my arms, calling his name in a rising panic. "Ethan, Ethan, stay with me." His eyes fluttered, unfocused, his lips pale, his pulse so faint I could barely find it. I pulled him into the roadside ditch, digging through the small medical kit I had shoved into my backpack in the frantic moments before we fled the safe house. The thin circle of my headlamp lit his face, slick with cold sweat, though the night itself was near freezing. He was losing blood fast, and the signs of infection were unmistakable. I forced myself to breathe steadily, peeling away his shirt and cutting through the soaked bandages with hands I refused to let tremble. The shoulder wound was red and swollen, heat radiating from it, the sharp, sour smell of infection rising the moment the air touched it. Without immediate care, he could slip into sepsis. I worked in silence, the way I had so many nights in the emergency room, flushing the wound with clean water, wiping carefully with antiseptic pads, then giving him the last dose of antibiotic I had. Ethan groaned softly, his brow tightening with pain, but his eyes still closed. I cupped his face gently, whispering with everything left in my heart, "I'm here. I won't let you die. Do you hear me? No matter what happens." His fingers curled weakly around mine, a fragile response, but enough to tell me he was still fighting. I checked his pulse again, weak but present. I stripped off my own coat, wrapped it around him, then pulled him close, pressing my body against his to keep him warm as the night air grew colder, the wind sweeping through the trees with a lonely, hollow cry I felt in my bones. We sat like that in the shallow ditch, my arms around the man I hadn't chosen at the beginning, but who had somehow become my entire world. Then an engine sounded in the distance. My heart seized, not knowing whether salvation or death was approaching. But I knew one thing for certain: if I stayed hiding in the dark, Ethan would not survive the night. I looked at him one last time, kissed his forehead, then rose to my feet and ran into the middle of the road, raising both arms to flag down the approaching vehicle without caring who it might be. Headlights blinded me bright enough to blur the world. The car screeched to a stop, tires skidding over gravel. The door flew open, and a middle-aged man leaned out, shock etched across his face. "What are you doing out here? There's someone hurt!" I gasped. "Please help me." Without waiting for his permission, I ran back to Ethan, hauling him up with every bit of strength I had left. The man saw his condition and rushed to help, lifting Ethan's weight with me. We got him into the back seat where he lay sprawled, his head in my lap, while I held his hand the entire ride as the kind stranger drove us toward the nearest town. The small hospital sign glowed in the distance, a pale beacon cutting through the darkness like a sliver of hope. I had no idea what waited for us next, whether Dominic would finish what he'd promised, whether eyes were already tracking us through the night. But I knew this: I had kept my promise. I had not let Ethan die. And in the moment I ran into the middle of that empty road, I realized I had done more than save a life. I had chosen a path, a new life entirely, and I was ready to follow it no matter what waited ahead. We arrived at Mercy Regional Hospital just before dawn, the flickering neon lights above the emergency entrance glowing like a quiet, fragile signal of last hope at the end of a long, desperate night. Ethan was rushed into the critical care unit, while I was held back to answer an onslaught of questions from the attending physician and administrative staff. I lied and told them he was my boyfriend, that he had been attacked while we were lost in the woods, and that we had been searching for help all night. They looked at me with suspicion, but perhaps the exhaustion etched into my face, or the severity of Ethan's condition, was enough to keep them from pressing further. I sat alone in the stark white hallway, my hands numb with cold, my clothes stiff with dried blood, the sharp scent of antiseptic burning the back of my throat. Each time the doors to the critical care room swung open, my heart tightened painfully. Then footsteps echoed from behind, steady and authoritative. I turned and saw two men in dark suits with small badges clipped at their belts. One of them was Special Agent Thomas Lang from the FBI. The other I did not recognize. "Ms. Morgan, I'm Agent Lang. We need to speak with you immediately." I stood too drained to be afraid. They led me into a small, empty interview room where warm yellow light cast my reflection onto the one-way mirror. Lang sat across from me and placed a thick file on the table. Ethan Walker, former Internal Intelligence Asset Primary Witness in a federal investigation involving money laundering and political assassinations tied to multiple high-ranking officials. He has been missing for nearly a year. And now he resurfaces gravely injured with you, a trauma nurse, the only person at his side. "Do you understand you are being investigated for harboring a federal fugitive?" I drew a deep breath and met his gaze. "I understand, but Ethan is not a criminal. He is being hunted by the very people who were supposed to protect him. And if I had not helped him, he would be dead." Lang was silent for a moment before opening the file and pulling out a thin document. "This is a mirrored copy of what Dominic Rivas sent us this morning, encrypted from an anonymous server. It contains all the classified data Ethan collected over 3 years of undercover work. The evidence is not only legitimate, it is enough to dismantle an entire inner circle power network." Lang's voice softened slightly as he looked at me. "You risked your life for him, but if we don't move now, not only you, but many innocent people could get caught in the fallout." I nodded. "Then do it. Protect him. Bring everything into the light." Lang exchanged a glance with his partner before facing me again. "We have already begun executing arrest warrants. But Ethan cannot stay here. We will place both of you in the Witness Protection Program. New names, new histories, new lives. But once you enter, there is no way back." I looked down at my hands, streaked with dried blood beneath my nails. I had crossed the line of ordinary choices long ago. I had nothing left to return to. The old life, the endless hospital shifts, the cold apartment, the quiet routines had all faded the moment Ethan grabbed my wrist in my living room and told me that if I didn't help him, we would both die. I lifted my head and answered plainly, "I agree, but only if he gets to live." Agent Lang nodded. and for the first time that morning, I saw something human in his eyes. "We will keep our word. Trust us one last time." When I stepped out of the room, Ethan was awake. He lay against crisp white sheets, his eyes still weak, but softening when he saw me enter, his lips barely parting. "Are you all right?" I nodded and sat beside him. "You did the right thing, Ethan. They know everything now. We're going to be protected." He took my hand, just as he had throughout every mile of the road we'd survived. But this time his grip was not trembling with fear, it held relief. "I'm grateful for you," he whispered. And in that small white room with the steady pulse of the heart monitor echoing like a quiet promise, I knew that while our journey was far from over, we had survived. Not because of luck, but because neither of us had let go. Not for a single moment. 3 weeks later, my name was Claire Bennett, 28 years old, a new laboratory technician at a small clinic on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. Ethan was now Daniel Carter, 36, working as a computer repair technician at a family-owned shop, only a few blocks from the small blue-roofed house we now called home. From the outside, with its wooden porch and bougainvillea climbing along the windows, we looked like any ordinary couple quietly building a new life in a peaceful town. But inside, we were still learning how to breathe in a world where everything about us was false. Each morning I made coffee in a white mug printed with my new name, practiced smiling when neighbors asked casual questions, learned to describe the old hometown I had never seen, and to remember the names of the imaginary friends the system had woven into my fabricated history. Ethan. No. Daniel played his role better than I did. He could chat with the plumber, ask prices at the hardware store, joke with the cashier without the slightest hesitation. Yet I knew that every time the windows rattled at night from a heavy gust of wind, he woke instantly, and whenever a shadow lingered too long near our porch, his hand twitched toward his side as if reaching for a weapon he no longer had. Living a manufactured life wears at the soul in quiet, exhausting ways. No friends, no family, no past to speak of, and no future we dared to plan. We had only each other and the scattered fragments of memory left after the storm we were now forced to pretend had never happened. On the quietest nights with the lights off and his arms around me, I would listen to his breathing and remember the first time I saw him bleeding on my living room floor, gripping my wrist, and telling me that if I didn't help, we would both die. Now we had survived, but survival had cost us pieces of ourselves we could never retrieve. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the eyes staring back, not because my appearance had changed, but because I had learned to see the world through a layer of protective fiction. We did not speak about what had happened. We did not mention Ray. We did not mention Dominic, who had done his part and vanished like a ghost. We did not ask whether that hidden network had truly been dismantled or whether someone still watched us from afar. Our silence was a form of self-defense, a thin wall we both knew was fragile, but kept in place to make life bearable. One afternoon, while trimming the grass in the yard, Ethan walked inside holding a small slip of paper someone had slipped into our mailbox. No sender's name, just a single handwritten line. "The press is beginning to uncover the truth. Everything will be re-examined. Hold your position. Things are changing." We stared at each other for a long time, after reading it, neither of us speaking, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, the first glimmer of light since we had arrived here. Hope, however fragile, is the one thing that allows people to endure a life without roots. That evening, Ethan cooked dinner an Italian pasta recipe he said he learned from his late father. We sat together with no gunfire, no footsteps in pursuit, only the soft chorus of crickets outside the porch and the warm glow of a quiet lamp. I watched him smile, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to believe that even in a world built from layers of deception, what we shared was real. And as long as that remained true, I could pretend to live a normal life every single day, so long as he was there beside me. We stayed in Asheville for another year before the official announcement came that the entire case had been declassified, made public, and closed. The powerful names once hidden behind the curtain were convicted, and the Witness Protection Program confirmed that no direct threat remained against us. Ethan's real identity was restored, and so was mine. After so many months living under borrowed names, Rachel Morgan and Ethan Walker could finally step back into the light without having to fabricate the smallest details of who we were. I expected relief, but the first thing I felt was emptiness. Because when you no longer have to pretend, you must truly begin again, and beginning again can be just as frightening as running for your life. Ethan made the first decision. He wanted to return to Chicago not out of longing, but to close the circle where everything had started. I hesitated, but I understood. We could not move forward while leaving broken pieces of our past unhealed. We came back on an October afternoon, the air cool enough for the autumn wind to sting the tip of my nose and brush gently through my hair. The city looked the same, yet everything inside me had changed. My old apartment on West Roscoe was now occupied by someone else. We simply stood across the street watching in silence. Ethan slipped his hand into mine. "Do you remember that night?" I smiled softly and nodded. "How could I forget? The place where you appeared covered in blood and fear. And the place where I chose you, even though I didn't yet know why." He pulled me closer, his eyes warm in a way I had only seen when he truly released the weight of his past. Maybe because he knew that if it hadn't been that night, if it hadn't been me, he would not be alive today. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small blue velvet box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring, exactly the kind I loved, understated, yet so quietly beautiful it stopped my breath. He didn't kneel. We had been through too much for ceremony. He simply looked at me and spoke gently as if the words had been waiting in him for a very long time. "Rachel Morgan, you saved my life. You believed in me when the rest of the world would not. You are the truest thing I have ever known. You are home. You are everything. Will you begin again with me, this time by choice, not out of fear, but out of love?" I couldn't speak. Tears fell silently, and I nodded again and again, as if my heart had been waiting for that question my entire life. I wrapped my arms around him in the very place where everything had once fallen apart, and where now everything began again. Not with gunfire, not with shadows lurking at our backs, but with two people, a promise and a love strong enough to survive the worst of the world. Ethan held me tightly and whispered against my ear like a vow. "This time, I will be the one protecting you." And I believed him with everything I had, and this time we would not run. We would live, truly live together. 10 years passed as if they were nothing more than the blink of an eye. Yet, when I looked in the mirror that morning, standing in the soft light of our warm wooden kitchen on the outskirts of Portland, I noticed the fine lines at the corners of my eyes had quietly settled into place as a natural part of my life. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, his hair threaded with a few strands of silver, though the way he looked at me remained exactly the same as the very first day, gentle, steady, and filled with a gratitude that never dimmed. Beside him, Mason, our 8-year-old son, was busy polishing the small trophy he had earned in his school relay race, recounting each second of the event with the excitement of someone describing an Olympic victory. I poured more coffee, smiling at the two people who had become the center of my world, and felt my heart respond, just as it had 10 years earlier, when Ethan whispered his proposal on the street, where everything began. After all that we had been through, we had rebuilt our lives, not as a facade or a refuge, but as something real with a home, a child's laughter, warm dinners, and slow, sleepy mornings tangled in soft blankets. Every weekend, we kept a small family tradition. We made pancakes together and told an old story, sometimes from my years in the hospital, sometimes from the day Ethan accidentally turned a printer into a heating device at the tech shop, and sometimes from the unbelievable but true memories of the night we fled through the woods, with blood soaking his shoulder and gunfire chasing our heels. Mason loved those stories, his eyes shining every time I mentioned the brown-haired girl who saved Dad in the cold, rainy night, and the tale became his favorite so quickly that Ethan eventually gave in and called it our family legend. We did not lie to Mason about our past, but we did not reveal everything either. One day when he is old enough, we will tell him that truth is rarely as simple as black or white, and that choices are not always made from right and wrong, but sometimes from what must be done. But we have already taught him the most important lesson, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward, even when fear tightens around every breath. Ethan now runs a self-defense training center for teenagers, teaching them how to protect themselves and how to stay calm when facing danger. I returned to medicine, not to the high-pressure emergency room, but to a small clinic where I help elderly patients ease their daily pain with medicine and gentle encouragement. Each year, on the exact day when Ethan collapsed into my apartment, a decade ago, bleeding and terrified and changing the course of my life forever, we take a day trip to a forest about 2 hours from Portland, not to relive the horror, but to remind ourselves of how far we have come. We sit by the fire while Mason plays with our golden retriever, a dog named Chance, a name Ethan chose to honor the second chance life had given us. And we both understand without needing to say it, that the shadows we once lived through are precisely what make the light we have now feel so extraordinary. I look at Ethan and see him looking back at me. No words, no vows, just a soft nod, a familiar touch, and the quiet certainty of his presence in every simple moment. And I know that no matter what the future brings, no matter how many more decades will pass, we will still have each other in every story we retell, in every embrace that steadies us in the dark, and in our family traditions, where old wounds have become strength for the generation that follows. That afternoon, the rain came suddenly streaking down the living room window like blurred memories sliding across glass. I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard Mason's hurried footsteps and the door slamming shut, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. "Are you all right?" I called out, still holding the dish towel. "No, Mom, come here. Hurry." There was something unfamiliar in his voice, a mix of urgency and anticipation I rarely heard from him. I wiped my hands and stepped out, and my heart seemed to stop for a beat when I saw Mason standing beside a boy I had never seen before, soaked from head to toe, his clothes torn, his face streaked with mud, and his wide eyes filled with a guarded watchfulness. He was no more than 11 or 12, thin as a reed, his lips pale from the cold. Mason looked at me as though he was pleading for something beyond the understanding of a child. "I found him in the woods near the oak grove. I think he's hurt. Maybe lost." I knelt down, met the boy's eyes, and tried to keep my voice as gentle as possible. "What's your name, sweetheart? Where did you come from?" He stayed silent. Not the fearful silence of a child caught in trouble, but the practiced silence of someone who has learned not to trust anyone. The sight of him pulled me back to a distant night, to Ethan lying on the floor of my Chicago apartment, blood soaking through his shirt, his lips trembling as he whispered that if I did not help, we would both die. I nodded to Mason and told him softly to take the boy upstairs, give him some of his old clothes, and that I would prepare something warm to eat. When the bedroom door closed, I stood alone in the living room, torn between instinct and memory. One part of me wanted to call the police, but the other part, the part that once reached out to save a stranger bleeding on my floor, knew that some people cross your path not to be handed over, but to be given a chance to live. Ethan came home while I was reheating soup on the stove. I told him everything slowly, without skipping a detail. He did not interrupt, only listened quietly, as though he were hearing a reflection of his own past, this time retold through our son. When I finished, he let out a long breath and gave a small, knowing smile. "Remember when I told you that some decisions aren't made with logic, that sometimes you only have 10 seconds to choose?" I nodded. "Mason doesn't know that," he said gently, "but his heart does. He chose. Just the way you chose me." That night, with the boy whose name we later learned was Eli sleeping in Mason's room, I sat beside Ethan on the porch, watching the rain drum softly against the shingles. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "Maybe it's fate repeating itself, or maybe it's simply compassion coming full circle. Whatever it is, our son did the right thing, and so did we." The next morning, we called an organization that supports missing children. Not the police, not the media, just a quiet phone call among people who once survived the shadows. They arrived a few hours later with a seasoned social worker and a warm blanket. Before leaving, Eli turned back to look at Mason, then at me. He did not speak, only gave a small nod. It was a tiny gesture, but in his eyes I saw an entire future one that perhaps had been opened by the choice our son made. And in that moment, I knew that this cycle, this instinct to reach out a hand to someone on the brink of collapse, would not end with my generation. It would continue carried forward by Mason's quiet courage and by everything Ethan and I have taught him, not through words, but through the way we choose to live each day. There are moments in life that seem like nothing more than a brief crossing of fate, yet when we look back, we understand they were the beginning of everything. A blood-soaked man collapsing in a living room reshaped the entire life of a young nurse. A whispered warning led to a choice between life and death. A single hand reached out, a single refusal to turn away, opened a path of survival for two people who had once been strangers. And now, 10 years later, as I watch my son extend his hand to a stranger in the middle of a storm, I understand that compassion does not die. It is passed on. Not through lectures or moral doctrines, but through the way we live, the way we love, the way we choose to act in the fleeting moments that shape the entire arc of a life. The greatest legacy Ethan and I can leave Mason is not wealth or a beautiful home or peaceful years, but a lesson in living, that there will be times when he does not have enough time to analyze what is right or wrong, yet, if he chooses to act with kindness and courage, he will never be wrong. Life will always be full of surprises, a night that changes everything, a stranger who needs saving, a single instant suspended between fear and hope. What matters is not how many dangers you avoid, but what you do when they stand before you. We are no longer people who have to run, but the memory of those months will always be a part of us. They remind us that true love is not born in calm, it is forged in hardship. And if you have ever loved someone enough to risk your entire life for them, you understand that sometimes, as long as they are beside you as a breath, a smile, a look, then everything is worth it. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the very end. If this journey has touched something quiet and deep within your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with those you love. Every share not only spreads a story but helps keep goodness alive in a world that changes faster than we can grasp. We would also love to hear your thoughts. What you felt about Ethan and Rachel's journey, whether any part of it mirrors your own life, or if you have ever had a moment where you had to choose in the blink of an eye. Leave a comment below so we can listen to your story as well. Perhaps somewhere in your words, someone who needs inspiration will find their own light. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video where more heartfelt stories are waiting to be told. Wishing you good health, gentle days, and peace in every moment. Goodbye, and see you again soon.